Okay, everybody, finally got my laptop back so I can do these things. So we're going to do two parts for the whole thing. So I hope I'm going to get it all in for part one here and then all in one recording for part two. So I'm going to go pretty quick. So it's media and essentially how media affects the political agenda, how media acts, and that kind of thing. Let's go through a couple definitions real quick. First, what is mass media? TV, radio, internet, magazines, newspapers, and other means of popular communication. A definition we'll need to know in a moment. Media events purposely staged for the media that usually look spontaneous. Sometimes it's called politics as theater. They can be staged by anyone from individuals to groups, especially the president. And with the exception, because President Trump was such a unique figure who didn't generally do the things that the presidents do as far as this goes. Just to give you an idea, for any time you see the president on TV somewhere doing something or what have you, it is staged. Okay, it's sometimes staged to look spontaneous, but it's staged, and that's one of the things that their media shops do. They do those things, and it's not just Biden. It's Biden. It's Obama. It's Bush. It's Clinton. They don't want that, or they want to make sure that the president is seen in as positive light as possible at any time the president is seen. So these things are staged. That's not saying it's a bad thing or anything like that. It's just something that they do. Okay. And then press conferences, there are meetings of public officials with reporters. They'll do a press conference at, the White House will do a press conference, or the president will do a press conference, or somebody at the Department of Defense will do a press conference, that. All right, so let's look at the media today. The media is key to controlling the political agenda because the idea is to get to the top of the daily news in a positive way. Okay, politicians use those media events we just talked about to do that, to try to drive the news cycle. Now, the news cycle is really fast today, it's 24/7. In the past, before the advent of the internet and then even the advent of cable with the CNNs and the Foxes and the MSNBCs, it was much slower of a news cycle. Again, getting positive coverage is critical. We'll talk about this actually in the second thing today. Again, just the idea that we might have this thing called the 30-second presidency or a soundbite presidency. We'll talk about that in the next presentation. And then again, day-to-day governing depends on the media as well, because you have to show it. It has to be seen. If you're doing something and nobody knows about it, it's really, if you want people to know about it, it's just not worthwhile unless people know about it. So you got to, and the media is used for that. Okay, media and politics starts with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, right? The radio was just invented in the 1920s, so he did 2 press conferences a week. Plus, he did those things. Hopefully, you learned in U.S. history, those fireside chats where he would sit and broadcast on the radio, and people would sit around their radios at home around the fireside, right, and listen to the president speaking basically directly to them. He did control the press by giving favorite reporters good stories and actually threatening other reporters if they were going to write a negative story or they wanted to. He might threaten them in some way or another, threaten their job, go to talk to their boss, whatever. It's just one of the ways that they do. He really controlled the press. There was from essentially from FDR, since we're talking about the media era, through to John F. Kennedy, so through to the mid 60s, there was a very cozy relationship between the press and the presidency. That changed in the 60s. But I'll give you an example. Prior to that, personal lives were off limits. Nobody outside of essentially Washington, D.C., knew that Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. Nobody knew that because the events were staged for him to look like he was not. It was anytime a picture of FDR was taken, it was going to be sitting in a chair, sitting in a car, or if he's standing up, standing behind a lectern so he can use that to help him balance and that kind of thing. It was just something that was done. And you can, an example here that's written down, President Kennedy's many infidelities while he was in the White House. The entire press corps knew about all of that stuff, but they just didn't report it. It was something that they didn't do at that time. That's all changed. And Vietnam and Watergate changed this cozy relationship. Okay, so in the mid and late 60s with LBJ in Vietnam, and then of course Watergate in the early 70s with President Nixon. It gives rise to something that's called investigative journalism. That's in-depth reporting to unearth scandals. It puts reporters sometimes in adversarial relationships with the political leaders, things like that. Sometimes there's a lot of it, sometimes there's a little bit of it. So that's sort of the way it is. But there is such a thing, and Woodward and Bernstein get their become the most famous ones with their unearthing of the Watergate stuff. All right, and depending on who the president is, there can be more negative than positive stories now, and that definitely depends. And we'll talk about media bias actually in the next part, in the next section, the next presentation. All right, so let's talk about types of media very quick. We're going to start going through these. The print media, the first and the original, right? Newspapers and magazines. Magazines, when we say magazines, we mean news magazines, which you may not have ever heard of. They're covered by the First Amendment. Very important. Very, very important. Means they are extremely free to print whatever they want. Print media, it's virtually an absolute thing, with the exception, of course, of being able to be sued for if it's print, it's libel or slander for speech. But other than that, you're as free to do as much as you want and to be as wrong as you want. They are much less influential, however, with the advent of television, and then, of course, now with the advent of the internet, much less influential than they used to be. We really only have 3 national newspapers anymore: New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, that have essentially a national following. Sometimes USA Today does. The main source of news, I don't know if anybody knows this, but the main source of news for most other newspapers is a wire service, and the biggest one is out there. It's called the Associated Press. They're the ones who do the reporting, and then they basically you subscribe to their service and you get their stories. And I'll give you a quick example. Excuse me. The city of Atlanta has a newspaper, right? Atlanta Journal-Constitution. If you look at that newspaper and it's a story about somewhere else, not the metro area or not Georgia, the story is probably not going to be from an AJC reporter. It's probably going to be from AP. And they'll say that. It'll be in the byline, right? AP in parentheses, and then the name of that particular reporter and whatnot. But that's the way they do it, because they can't afford anymore to have their reporters all out in all different places. So they subscribe to this, and they use the stories from AP, or there are a couple other ones. There's one called UPI and one called Reuters, but AP is the okay. Magazines, then, the other print media. News magazines are virtually non-existent anymore, and the why, hopefully you can figure this out, is because at best they came every week. They came in your mailbox. You subscribed to them. It came in your mailbox, and it's always at least a week late. If it comes every week, it's a week late. It's always behind. We are not in for that anymore, right? We are in for instantaneous. We need it now. We need it now. We need it yesterday. So those things really, as far as an in-person delivered to your house thing, virtually non-existent anymore. Of course, they do have some online presence. And print media, magazines, newspapers are having a difficult time, or have been having a difficult time finding a place in this internet age, right? You can see it on your computer or on your phone. You don't need to go and pick up a newspaper or have a newspaper delivered to your house. It's a little bit different than it used to be. I'll give you an idea. This is not a testable thing or anything. The Newsweek sold for $1 in 2010. That doesn't mean an issue of the magazine sold for $1. That means the entire company, Newsweek, was bought for $1. Okay? And the thing is that group who bought it, they had to assume all of Newsweek's debt. Newsweek was in terrible debt, and they could not continue anymore, so they sold their magazine for $1. All right, additional then, we get to broadcast. Lots of differences between broadcast media and print media. So we're talking about television and radio here. Early political careers were made or not made by TV. If you took U.S. history already, hopefully you talked about this in 1960, the Nixon-Kennedy debate, where Kennedy was aware of television, was aware that you needed makeup to not look washed out, all of that stuff. Nixon was not. Nixon looked terrible. He was sweating. He was a little bit sick at that time. And it just on TV, it was just this stark difference between this young, charismatic, good-looking, at least on TV, so not washed out with makeup and all of that, versus this slightly older guy who was sweating all the time. And also, it just didn't look. It looked bad, and it made Kennedy's career. It was one of the big things that pushed him towards victory. And one of the things, just to give you an idea of the power of TV, is that when polls were taken afterwards, the people who watched the debate on TV said that Kennedy won. The people who listened to the debate on the radio said Nixon won. So that gives you an idea of the power of visual, the power of TV. And TV will become the most important communication medium in politics, and it probably even still is today, whether we call that TV or cable or even some of the streaming stuff, although those are usually just movies and stuff. And why would that be? And it's about visuals. There is a difference. Just think about it. Is there a difference between you seeing something or reading about something? And you know that there is a difference to seeing it with your own eyes than with just reading about it. So Vietnam, give you an idea. Vietnam was the first televised war. It was different. You saw it every night. I do remember this. I was so towards the end of the Vietnam War, which ended essentially for the U.S. in 1973. So in 1973, I was 10. So 8, 9, and 10. Those times of the early 70s. I do remember because the only thing that was on TV was news at 6:30 every night. It was either ABC, CBS, NBC, whatever. So you'd watch the news, and that was the only news other than newspapers and you or radio, and you would watch the news, and every night you were guaranteed to see some footage from Vietnam, and it wasn't going to be flattering all the time. You're going to see body bags, and you're going to see people engaged in firefights and things like that, and it was just different. And also think about the protests that were being covered as well. Those were visual, those were seen, so those had an effect. And I'll give you one more example. Just think about same era of time, the 1960s and the civil rights movement. There's a difference. Say you're sitting in your house in Minnesota or South Dakota or somewhere, and you read a newspaper and you read about Birmingham, and you read about the confrontation between the peaceful marchers in Birmingham, or maybe Selma, Alabama, or whatever. Birmingham is where they used fire hoses and dogs against them and all of that. There's a difference between reading about it and seeing it on TV. When you see it, it has such a different reaction. It has such a different idea in your mind, and it's very, very important. Visual is so important. Walter Cronkite, Vietnam, he started to say Vietnam was not worth it. He was the main guy. He was called the most trusted man in America. He was one of the news anchors. I think he worked for CBS. And then, of course, now with the advent of cable, the news cycle is 24/7. 24/7, 24/7. We want it, we want it, we want it. And then that gives rise to, of course, starting with CNN back in the early days of cable, in 1980, 81. And then Fox starting in 1996, MSNBC somewhere around that same time. So that gives rise to that. So that's another part of it now. All right, quickly, I got to go through government regulation. The First Amendment and broadcast media. Broadcast media is regulated by the government. Print media cannot be because of the First Amendment. So why is this the problem? The main problem was with overlapping frequencies. If you know anything about the broadcasting, we're talking about radio at first, and then with TV, it uses frequencies, and it broadcasts in frequencies, whether AM or FM, and you have the receiver that receives AM or FM, and you tune it to the right frequency, and you got your stuff. If two things in the same area are broadcasting on the same frequency, all you're going to get is garbage. So that was the main problem early on, was to make sure that there were separate frequencies for different radio stations and then television stations later on. So those had to be regulated. So you had to get a license. So the FCC was created in 1934. That's an independent regulatory agency. You got to remember that from Unit 2, right? It was formed in 34 to regulate the airwaves. So it does some other things too that the First Amendment would certainly bar if it was print. Limit station ownership. No single owner can control more than 35% of a single market. So say the Atlanta metro area is a market, and you can only have a single owner or single corporation can only own as much as 35%, and that's it, of that market. They control licensing. Stations, you have to get a license, and the license requires you to do certain things. You have to give, and this is part of the license part, fair treatment to political candidates and office holders. And this, of course, sort of goes here, and sort of providing equal time at the same rate. So if you've got a person running for Senate in Georgia, and you sell him ads as this media entity, you have to sell that opponent's ads the same amount of time at least, and at the same rate. So you can't do different things there, if of course they want it. And the last are two things: narrowcasting. That's now like the ESPNs and the History Channels and 24-hour news. Instead of broadcasting, it's narrowcasting certain things aimed at certain audiences. More and more things are available for consumption. However, the more there is, the reliability is more and more suspect. We have to be good consumers of the news. I'll let you read that. And then last thing, government owns much of television in most countries, not in the U.S. That makes the U.S. very, very different from other places where the media is in private hands, and there's just media or public funding for things like PBS, but that's about it. Private ownership plus First Amendment means much more media freedom in the United States because they're dependent on advertising now. They have to make money. They are not dependent on the government allowing them to do stuff, okay? So they do it on their own. However, indeed, many media outlets are now owned by huge corporations. If you did not know, ABC is owned by Disney. ESPN is owned by Disney. General Electric owns Comcast and NBC, and the variety of things that go with that, like all those Discovery Channel things, I think are in the NBC family. A company called Viacom owns CBS. Fox owns Fox. So lots of stuff out there. And then newspapers are also controlled by large chains as well. Okay, my time has run out. If this doesn't